Welcome back to this series of videos that's going to look at how to answer the AQA GCSE history questions on paper 1, Understanding the Modern World. In this video we're going to look at the final source question. And this is it. It's an 8-mark question and it asks you which interpretation do you find more convincing. It'll be 8 marks and it'll always have that kind of structure. So you use the same sources as you used for question 1 and for question 2. And this time you really need to think about technique. This one is a question that a lot of my students have found challenging. Now here's the question again. It's an 8-mark question, so you need to do 2 paragraphs and spend 10 minutes on those paragraphs. But I want you to do something when you look at the exam paper. I want you to look at the word convincing and just mentally cross it out in your head. And instead I want you to write the word accurate, because this question wants you to assess how accurate you find the 2 interpretations about whatever they're about. It wants you to use your knowledge to assess the accuracy of the content of the source. So as you can see from the mark scheme, they want you to be able to evaluate what the interpretation says using your contextual knowledge and your understanding of the period in order to form a sustained judgment about how convincing or how accurate it is. So, the part of the source that you need to use is the content. It's the same as question 1, and you don't need to get bogged down in the provenance of the interpretation. It's not especially relevant. So again, I've crossed through the provenance and I've circled and highlighted the bit that I need to use. And I've done it for both sources, so just to make sure that you're thinking about the right things. So, here's interpretation A, and here are the key things that it says. So one thing it says is that Roosevelt was like a dictator due to policies like the New Deal, and it says that in the bit that I've highlighted red. The closing of the banks and the introduction of a New Deal for the American people sounded to me like a possible dictatorship. And the second thing it says is that Roosevelt, or it suggests, is that Roosevelt was unpopular and that people protested against him. You can see that by the bits I've highlighted in yellow. So there's a demonstration that employed during President Roosevelt's inauguration, and that people didn't have any confidence in him. So then what you need to do is use these to test against your knowledge. These are the bits that you're going to use to test the accuracy or how convincing the interpretation is. And I've done the same thing for the second interpretation, which suggests that Roosevelt moved society forward through the New Deal, and that through his presidency, Roosevelt actually prevented a dictatorship. So there's a bit of comparison between the two that you could use. So in terms of writing this up, you want to have 2 paragraphs that have this sort of structure. You want to make a judgment at the top, then introduce what the source says, then test it using your own knowledge, and then try to directly compare the 2 interpretations. So your judgment, you need to say whether or not you find the interpretation that you're talking about convincing. Then you can either paraphrase or you can quote from the source. I think it's better to paraphrase because you're showing the examiner that you understand the source. That highlights what they say. So you might say that interpretation A thought that Roosevelt was a dictator, or you could say that interpretation B thought that Roosevelt brought society forward. You then test that view with your own knowledge. So do you agree or not with what the source says about Roosevelt? And then this last bit, the comparison, that's your level 4 skill. That will be for those students that are looking for 8s and 9s. Can you directly compare what you've said about interpretation A with interpretation B? So here's a model paragraph. As you can see, with the first sentence, I've clearly made a judgment. Interpretation A is not very convincing. Then I've talked about the source. So what does the source say? Well, it says that policies like the emergency bank holiday and the New Deal were making Roosevelt into the dictator. So I've paraphrased the source, I've brought in some contextual knowledge to show the examiner my level of understanding. And then here, I've explained why I think that's not accurate, why I don't think it's convincing. So I've used my own knowledge of the fireside chats, my explanation of the impact that had, to show that he wasn't a dictator. And then I've compared the two by saying, well, B is more convincing because B clearly says he prevented a dictatorship. So reviewing this answer, you can see that the bulk of the answer is that explanation of accuracy. Do I believe with my own knowledge that what that interpretation says is the most accurate way of portraying it? And that is the bit that's going to get you into level 3. And AQA have said that if you consistently get level 3 marks, you will get a grade 7. So it's a really good place to be. So to finish off my answer, I'd add another paragraph about interpretation B following the same kind of structure, and that would give me a full 8 marks. So, to recap, cross out the word convincing in the question and write the word accurate instead. You want to test the accuracy of the source, so you only look at the content of the source. That's step 2. Only look at the bit of the source where it talks about President Roosevelt, where it talks about the lives of women, where it talks about President Hoover, or whatever the question in your examination will look at. Then, looking at interpretation 1, you need to follow the judgment source, own knowledge, compare technique in order to fully assess the accuracy to give you the best chance of getting as many marks as possible. Then step 4, you repeat that for interpretation 2. And that should give you 8 marks. But the key bit that I've not written on there, but the key bit that you always need to remember is that this should take 10 minutes maximum, because you don't want to waste time, so you don't miss out on the big mark questions towards the end of the paper. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful. If you keep checking back to my channel to find out more, looking at the exam technique for the AQA history paper.